Charles Bronson made a career playing men of few words and deadly action. On screen, his characters were unforgiving, unflinching, and unapologetic. Off-screen, turns out he wasn't acting much at all. He didn't talk much, but if he didn't like you, you felt it. In Hollywood's golden era of tough guys, Charles Bronson stood apart. The coal miner's son with the weathered face and steely gaze who brought an authentic hardness to the screen that pretty boy actors couldn't touch. While others played at being dangerous, Bronson exuded menace without even trying. His silence wasn't a technique. It was who he was. But that same authentic toughness that made him a global action star also made him one of Hollywood's most difficult collaborators. Behind those granite features and measured silence lurked judgments, resentments, and a surprising capacity for holding grudges against fellow actors who crossed his carefully guarded boundaries. Charles didn't hate many people, recalled one longtime crew member who worked on multiple Bronson films. But when he did, it was absolute. There was no coming back from it. Today, we're counting down the 6 actors who experienced the cold fury of Charles Bronson. Men who discovered that earning his contempt meant enduring a silence more punishing than any shouting match. These weren't just professional disagreements. They were clashes of philosophy about what it meant to be a man in Hollywood. Charles Bronson. Even his name sounds like it was chiseled from stone. Born Charles Buczynski to a Lithuanian immigrant family in the coal mining region of Pennsylvania, Bronson's path to stardom wasn't paved with privilege. He worked in the mines starting at age 10, served in World War II and fought his way up through Hollywood's ranks with the same grim determination that defined his most famous characters. This hardscrabble background formed the lens through which Bronson viewed his fellow actors. In an industry filled with theatrical training and practiced charm, Bronson brought something different, an authenticity born of genuine struggle, and he had little patience for performers he deemed inauthentic, entitled, or undeserving of their success. Charles had a built-in detector, explained a director who worked with him in the 1970s. He could spot a fake from a mile away, and he couldn't hide his contempt. Wouldn't even try to. This uncompromising nature made Bronson a powerful screen presence, but a complicated colleague. His judgments once formed were nearly impossible to reverse. And for a select group of Hollywood actors, earning Bronson's disdain meant enduring it not just for a single production, but for decades. Let's count down the 6 men who found themselves permanently on the wrong side of Charles Bronson's unforgiving judgment. And why even decades later, the chill remains. Ladies and gentlemen, number 6, Burt Reynolds. Never joke about a stone face. In the pantheon of 1970s male movie stars, few shone brighter than Burt Reynolds. With his rakish mustache, devil-may-care smile, and playful public persona, Reynolds represented a kind of masculine charisma that was the polar opposite of Bronson's stoic intensity. Where Bronson was stone, Reynolds was mercury, fluid, flashy, and impossible to pin down. Their collision course was set not on a film set, they never actually worked together, but through the media, where Reynolds's quick wit would prove to be the match that lit Bronson's slow-burning fuse. During a 1973 talk show appearance, Reynolds was asked about the new wave of action stars. With his characteristic smirk, he quipped that Charles Bronson was a guy with one facial expression who's made a career out of it. The audience laughed. The host laughed. But Charles Bronson, watching from home, did not laugh. For Bronson, whose minimalist acting style was a deliberate choice rather than a limitation, Reynolds' comment wasn't just a joke. It was a dismissal of everything he stood for as a performer. Bronson had fought too hard, for too long, to be reduced to a punchline by an actor he viewed as all charm and no substance. I was with Charles when he heard about Reynolds' comment. He didn't explode like you might expect. He just went very quiet, which was actually more frightening. Then he said, "Some men talk, other men do." That was it. But the temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees, recalled Bronson's longtime stunt coordinator. The feud might have ended there, a one-sided grudge nursed in private, had Reynolds not doubled down. In his 1974 Cosmopolitan interview, when asked which actors he admired, Reynolds mentioned several contemporaries, but conspicuously omitted Bronson, adding that he preferred actors who can do more than squint. Word got back to Bronson, as it always did in Hollywood's echo chamber. His response was characteristic in its brutal efficiency. "Reynolds talks too much for a tough guy. In my day, men who looked like that were women." What made the conflict particularly telling was how it highlighted the competing definitions of masculine stardom in that era. Reynolds, with his self-deprecating humor and comfort in the spotlight versus Bronson with his flinty seriousness and disdain for Hollywood's publicity machine. When Reynolds experienced his career downturn in the early 1980s, Bronson was reportedly unmoved by his rival's struggles. Asked by a close associate if he had seen Reynolds' latest flop, Bronson simply replied, "Talking catches up with everyone eventually." Number 5, Sean Connery. When two icons collide. On paper, Charles Bronson and Sean Connery might have been allies. Both came from working-class backgrounds. Connery had been a milkman and coffin polisher before acting, while Bronson had worked the Pennsylvania coal mines. Both built careers playing men of action rather than words. Both brought a dangerous physical presence to the screen that pretty boy actors couldn't match. Yet rather than brotherhood, their similar positions in Hollywood's ecosystem bred competition, resentment, and a coldness that would span decades. The breaking point came in 1975 when both were considered for the lead in John Milius's adventure epic, The Wind and the Lion. The role of Berber chieftain Mulai Ahmed Arazali required a commanding physical presence and an air of exotic menace. On those requirements, either man could have delivered. But the role went to Connery, a decision that reportedly infuriated Bronson. Charles took it personally. He felt Connery was just playing dress-up, a Scotsman pretending to be Moroccan while he had the authentic ruggedness the role demanded. He said, "They cast a man with an accent playing a man with an accent. At least mine would have been real," recalled a producer on Death Wish who worked with Bronson during this period. The professional rivalry might have remained just that had the two men not encountered each other at a Hollywood function shortly after The Wind and the Lion's release. According to witnesses, Connery, who was unaware of Bronson's resentment, approached him with a collegial greeting. Bronson's response was ice cold, a barely perceptible nod before turning away. When asked later by a confused associate why he had snubbed one of Hollywood's biggest stars, Bronson reportedly said, "I don't act with people who think they're royalty." The comment revealed a fundamental misreading of Connery, who despite his success, remained proudly working class in his outlook and friendships. But for Bronson, Connery represented a type of actor he deeply distrusted: European, theatrical, and embraced by the critical establishment in a way that Bronson, despite his commercial success, never was. Charles couldn't understand how Connery got to be considered this great actor while he was still seen as just an action star, explained a director who worked with Bronson in the late 1970s. The fact that they were from similar backgrounds made it worse, not better. Charles felt Connery had somehow sold out to become acceptable to Hollywood in a way he refused to do. Number 4, Richard Chamberlain. Oil and water on the high seas. If Bronson's conflicts with Burt Reynolds and Sean Connery were rooted in competing versions of masculine stardom, his contempt for Richard Chamberlain represented something more fundamental. A clash between two entirely different approaches to the craft of acting itself. Their worlds collided in 1969 on the set of The Sea Wolf, a television adaptation of Jack London's brutal maritime tale. Bronson, then 48 and still fighting for leading roles after years of supporting parts, played Wolf Layson, the tyrannical ship captain. Chamberlain, already famous from his star-making role in Dr. Kildare and widely considered one of Hollywood's most handsome men, was cast as the intellectual Humphrey Van Weyden. On paper, the contrast between the two actors perfectly matched their characters. Bronson's weathered physicality versus Chamberlain's refined bearing. But what worked as dramatic tension on screen created genuine friction behind the scenes. It was like watching matter and antimatter try to occupy the same space, recalled a crew member. Chamberlain was all technique, training, and conscious craft. Bronson was pure instinct and lived experience. They couldn't even communicate about acting because they were speaking different languages. Tensions escalated during a pivotal confrontation scene. After multiple takes where Chamberlain delivered his lines with increasing emotional intensity, Bronson reportedly turned to the director and asked, "Is he going to do that acting thing every time? Because I can't work with that." The air just went out of the room. Richard turned white. He trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. And here was this guy with no formal training essentially telling him he was fake. You could see him struggling not to respond. "Charles just lit a cigarette and waited like he had all day," said an assistant director on The Sea Wolf. For Chamberlain, who had worked with some of Britain's most respected theatrical actors, Bronson's comment wasn't just rude. It was a fundamental challenge to his identity as a performer. When filming concluded, Chamberlain reportedly refused to do joint press appearances and the two men never worked together again. Charles viewed acting as something you did, not something you talked about, explained a longtime associate. To him, Chamberlain's approach wasn't just different. It was somehow dishonest, like putting on airs. And nothing triggered Charles faster than what he perceived as falseness. Number 3, Tony Curtis. The pretty boy versus the coal miner. The conflict between Charles Bronson and Tony Curtis illuminates perhaps the most fundamental divide in Hollywood's ecosystem. The tension between actors who rose through the studio system's star-making machinery and those who fought their way up through sheer grit and determination. Their paths crossed on the set of 1963's The Great Escape, a film that would eventually launch Bronson towards stardom, but in which he was still part of the ensemble, while Curtis received second billing behind Steve McQueen. Curtis, born Bernard Schwartz to Hungarian Jewish immigrants, had been discovered and developed by Universal Studios, which polished his rough edges and groomed him into a heartthrob. By the time he arrived on the Great Escape set, he was Hollywood royalty. Bronson, still using his birth name, Buczynski, for some of his earlier roles, had none of that pedigree. His path to the screen included coal mining as a child, military service in World War II, and years of bit parts and villain roles. Every inch of progress in his career had been hard-won without the benefit of studio grooming or matinee idol looks. According to cast members, Curtis arrived on set with an entourage and special accommodations while Bronson showed up alone, ready to work without fanfare. Tony was a star and he carried himself like one. Remembered a production assistant. The special food requests, private trailer, the fussing over his wardrobe. Charles watched all this with these hooded eyes, not saying a word, but you could feel the temperature drop whenever they were in the same space. The breaking point came during filming of a scene where several POWs, including characters played by both men, were discussing escape plans. Curtis reportedly interrupted multiple takes to adjust his lighting and positioning, concerned about how he would appear on camera. After the third such interruption, Bronson walked off set, telling the assistant director, "Call me when the beauty pageant is over." I was standing right there when Charles said it. Tony heard him and his face just froze. He wasn't used to being talked to that way, especially not by someone he considered a character actor rather than a star. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, said an actor who played a supporting role in The Great Escape. Behind Curtis's back, Bronson reportedly referred to him as a polished poodle, meticulously groomed, but ultimately domesticated. Their scenes together in the finished film betray none of this tension, but they never worked together again. By now, you've likely noticed a pattern form. Bronson's deepest resentments weren't random. They targeted men who represented everything he fought against in his own career. Privilege, polish, and paths to stardom that seemed easier than his own brutal climb. But the feuds we're about to explore cut even deeper. These weren't just professional rivalries or clashing approaches to craft. These were visceral, personal animosities that revealed the wounds beneath Bronson's impenetrable exterior. Conflicts that followed him to the grave. Number 2, Telly Savalas. A set too small for two alphas. If Charles Bronson's conflicts with pretty boy stars like Tony Curtis arose from class resentment, his legendary clash with Telly Savalas was something far more primal. Two alpha predators forced to share the same territory. Their explosive confrontation occurred on the set of 1972's Red Son. Note, the text originally said Ponchovia, but this is likely a misremembering of Red Son, a western where Savalas played a supporting role and Bronson portrayed the lead. Both men were at crucial junctures in their careers. Savalas on the verge of superstardom with Kojak. Bronson finally achieving leading man status after decades of supporting roles. What made their conflict uniquely volatile was how similar they were on paper. Both were late-blooming stars with unconventional looks. Both came from immigrant families. Both had served in World War II, and both had spent years playing heavies before landing leading roles. But where Bronson was quiet, Savalas was boisterous. Where Bronson was stoic, Savalas was expressive. It was like watching matter and antimatter, recalled a crew member. Telly was this big, expansive personality, always talking, laughing, holding court between takes. Charles would sit alone, smoking, watching him with these eyes that gave away nothing. But you could feel the tension building with every day. The breaking point came during a pivotal confrontation scene between their characters. According to multiple witnesses, Savalas kept adjusting his positioning to dominate the frame, gradually edging Bronson out of his lighting. After several such adjustments, Bronson stopped the scene. "I've been watching you," he told Savalas in a voice just loud enough for nearby crew to hear. "This isn't your first rodeo. You know exactly what you're doing." Savalas, unaccustomed to being called out, responded with characteristic bravado. "Maybe you should worry less about where I'm standing and more about your performance." The set went silent for a moment. Crew members feared the confrontation might turn physical. Instead, Bronson turned to the producer, who had rushed over to defuse the situation and delivered an ultimatum that would become legendary in Hollywood circles. "If he talks again during my scene, I walk." You could hear a pin drop. No one moved. Charles didn't raise his voice. He never did. But there was something in his tone that made everyone freeze. Telly, who normally had a comeback for everything, just stared. "I think it was the first time in years someone had stood up to him," said an assistant director on the film. Savalas, perhaps recognizing that Bronson wasn't bluffing, backed down. The scene was completed without further incident, but the damage was done. For the remainder of the shoot, the two men communicated only through intermediaries. What made the conflict particularly fascinating was how it played out in the finished film. Despite their personal animosity, or perhaps because of it, their scenes together crackle with genuine tension. As one critic noted, when Bronson and Savalas face off, you're not watching acting. You're watching two men who genuinely can't stand each other. Number 1, James Coburn. The cool that Bronson couldn't match. Of all Charles Bronson's Hollywood feuds, none ran deeper or lasted longer than his Cold War with James Coburn. What began during the filming of 1960's The Magnificent Seven evolved into a decades-long animosity that revealed the most vulnerable aspects of Bronson's carefully guarded psyche. The Magnificent Seven represented a career breakthrough for both men. Though neither had a leading role, Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen commanded top billing. The film elevated both from bit players to recognizable character actors. But their approaches to both life and craft could not have been more different. Coburn, tall and loose-limbed with an easy smile, embodied a natural cool that seemed effortless. His knife-throwing expert, Britt, delivered the film's most memorable performance with the fewest lines, creating impact through physical presence and precise minimalism. On set, Coburn was relaxed, popular with the crew, and untroubled by the Hollywood hierarchy. Bronson, by contrast, brought an intensity to every scene that reflected his own tightly wound personality. Where Coburn projected an easy confidence, Bronson radiated coiled tension. Where Coburn charmed effortlessly, Bronson remained watchful and reserved. They were like opposing elements, recalled a crew member. Coburn was water, flowing, adaptable, impossible to grasp. Bronson was stone, solid, immovable, but brittle under enough pressure. From day one, Charles watched Jim with these narrowed eyes like he was trying to solve a puzzle. The source of Bronson's resentment wasn't professional jealousy, but something more complex. Coburn possessed a quality Bronson had spent his life trying to cultivate, yet could never quite achieve: authentic cool under pressure. The tension came to a head during filming of a pivotal scene where the 7 gunfighters ride into the Mexican village they've been hired to protect. After multiple takes, director John Sturges praised Coburn's relaxed posture on horseback, suggesting the other actors could learn from his natural ease. For Bronson, who had spent hours practicing his riding to ensure he looked authentic, the comment was a direct hit to his professional pride. I saw Charles's face when Sturges said that. Just for a second, the mask slipped and there was this flash of pure, I don't know what to call it, not anger exactly, more like humiliation. Then it was gone and the stone face was back, but he never forgot it. Never, said an actor who worked with both men on The Magnificent Seven. Throughout the 1960s, they often competed for the same roles, with Coburn frequently winning the more prestigious parts. Critics praised Coburn's effortless charisma and range while Bronson continued to battle typecasting as a heavy. What makes the Bronson-Coburn feud so revealing is how one-sided it ultimately was. While Bronson nursed his grievances for decades, Coburn rarely spoke ill of him, telling an interviewer in the 1990s, "Charles is Charles. He sees the world his way. It's not my place to judge that." In his unforgiving judgment of Coburn, Bronson revealed not just professional envy, but a deeper inability to reconcile with his own limitations. A rigidity of character that both made his career and ultimately constrained it. The man behind the fortress. Looking back across these 6 relationships, from his volcanic clash with Telly Savalas to his icy decades-long estrangement from James Coburn, a complex portrait emerges not just of Charles Bronson, the actor, but Charles Bronson, the man. Behind the granite facade and vigilante roles was someone far more vulnerable than his public image suggested. A man whose conflicts with fellow actors revealed the wounds and insecurities he otherwise kept hidden from the world. The pattern of Bronson's feuds tells a story. He didn't resent actors randomly. His contempt targeted specific types. The naturally charismatic Coburn, the classically trained Chamberlain, the media-savvy Reynolds, the critically respected Connery. In each case, these men possessed qualities or advantages that Bronson had fought for but never fully achieved despite his commercial success. Charles came up the hardest way possible, noted a director who worked with him in the 1970s. Coal mines as a child, combat in World War II, years of bit parts and rejection. By the time success came, he built these walls so high that no one could really reach him anymore, not even himself. This psychological fortress served Bronson well in creating his iconic screen persona. The emotionless avenger, the unflappable professional, the man whose moral compass never wavered despite the chaos around him. But the same rigidity that made him millions at the box office exacted a heavy personal toll, isolating him from colleagues who might have been allies and friends. By the end of his career, Bronson had become as solitary in reality as the lone wolf characters he portrayed on screen. While contemporaries like Clint Eastwood expanded their artistic range as they aged, Bronson seemed locked into both his screen persona and his private grudges, unable or unwilling to evolve. The legacy of unforgiving judgment. Charles Bronson passed away in 2003 at the age of 81, having lived long enough to see his style of uncompromising, physically imposing masculinity fade from Hollywood's leading roles. He died as he had lived, privately, away from the spotlight, his true thoughts known only to his closest family. What remains is not just his filmography, but the complex web of relationships, both positive and negative, that defined his place in Hollywood's ecosystem. The 6 men who experienced Bronson's coldest fury each represented different aspects of the industry he simultaneously conquered and held at arm's length throughout his career. For the colleagues who felt Bronson's unforgiving judgment, the experience often proved transformative. James Coburn, after recovering from his debilitating arthritis, spoke philosophically about mortality and forgiveness, a perspective that perhaps contributed to his Oscar-winning performance in Affliction. Richard Chamberlain evolved from pretty boy lead to respected character actor, developing a versatility that Bronson might have dismissed, but that ultimately extended his career far longer. Even Burt Reynolds, whose joke about Bronson's one expression earned such lasting contempt, eventually gained perspective on the fragility of stardom after his own career collapse and comeback. "When you've been on top and then hit bottom," Reynolds said in his later years, "you learn not to judge other actors so quickly. We're all just trying to survive in a tough business." The irony is that Bronson, for all his judgments of others, remained perhaps the least self-reflective major star of his generation. While contemporaries like Clint Eastwood and Sean Connery publicly examined their evolving perspectives on masculinity in their earlier work, Bronson maintained his code without apology or amendment until the end. Charles Bronson didn't talk much, but if he didn't like you, you felt it. From his Cold War with James Coburn to his explosive confrontation with Telly Savalas, Bronson's Hollywood feuds reveal the complex man behind the vigilante roles, a coal miner's son who fought his way to international stardom without ever quite letting go of the battles that shaped him. What makes these stories so compelling isn't just the behind-the-scenes drama between famous men, but what they tell us about Hollywood's golden age of tough guys. An era when competing visions of masculinity played out not just on screen, but in the conflicts between the actors themselves. For Bronson, these weren't just professional disagreements, but moral judgments, reflections of a rigid code that both made his career and ultimately limited it. Each feud revealed something about what Bronson valued and what he despised in his fellow performers. Yet, there's something undeniably powerful about Bronson's consistency. In an industry built on reinvention and compromise, he remained defiantly, stubbornly himself. A quality that earned him millions of fans worldwide, even as it cost him relationships within Hollywood.